Morning, everybody.
Morning.
It's of course my pleasure to be here. Yeah. Okay, what I want to do then is I'm not going to talk about the alternatives, and the initiatives that we are undertaking, but basically focus on how I look at the realities in the Malaysian situation, and I want to actually take you through history a bit. Okay, and I think this is important to sort of like understand where we are now. And the first point I want to make is that actually the educational system in Malaysia is extremely centralized, very centralized. And the federal government has played a major role in shaping this educational policy. And in this regard, it has always argued that its policies are guided by three objectives. The first point is that we need to expand democratized educational opportunities to enhance the growth and development of the youth. So, this is very important. We have a growing population, and in a sense, this has been achieved to a great extent. And I'll take you through the various stages, how this has evolved over time. So, we must acknowledge this important aspect of our educational system. You're talking about, and I use the word democratization. If you're interested in democratization, then you have to acknowledge that actually education in Malaysia is extremely democratized in the sense of reaching out to people, or the other term that we sometimes use is the massification of education. Second point, in view of Malaysia's status as a developing country, we need to prepare students to contribute towards development. Invariably, the emphasis is given to science and technology, and once upon a time, I wasn't particularly interested, and you sometimes also channel your top students to go and do science, when actually they might be more interested in poetry, want to learn from brother Vincent, but we channel them to science and technology. Economics management, and last, the humanities and social science. Now, third point is that the government again tries to rationalize what it's doing in terms of how in Malaysia we have this plural society, and so we must foster national unity. There has been relative success, but also problems. I want to take a historical perspective in discussing the development of education in Malaysia. I break this down into 5 main periods: colonial period up to 41, the decade of decolonization after the war, integration in common educational system, the problems of restructuring that follows NEP, and then the 1990s and beyond. I should speak briefly about then the first 3 periods. Most of you are already familiar with this, but it's worth re-emphasizing today. And then talk about last 2 periods, and then I'll identify the problems and their causes in broad terms. This colonial period was a period when the government, the colonial state, had a minimalist role. Main involvement was the development of Malay primary education, which was paternalistic in nature. They wanted to make these people better agriculturalists, farmers. They weren't thinking of turning them into doctors and scientists. Small numbers were then also recruited to SITC, now UPSI, in Tanjung Malim, and the Malay Women's Teachers Training College, Malacca, in the colonial period. Colonial state did not provide education to children of the Chinese and Indian laborers, considered it to be the responsibility of the employers in the plantations, in the tin mines that I studied, I cannot recall that there was any primary school that was created at that point, but perhaps later. The minimalist role played by colonial government, the minimalist role even in the development of English education, for instance, the PFS in Penang, Victoria Institute, Malay College, Kuala Kangsar, most of the English schools were established then by the Christian missions, including, of course, the Lasallian, the IJs, Methodist schools and all that. So this was actually the extent of the spread of English schools. At any rate, English schools were elite institutions. They offered limited places to a minority of children living mainly in the urban major towns, and so St. Xavier's would have a hostel, and then people from out of state would be able to come to attend. Majority of students were Chinese and Indians. So this point, very elitist. Today we think back about those periods as though they were very glorious times, but in fact, it was very, very elitist and not democratic at all. The Chinese schools emerged as a result of non-profit community initiatives. The number of schools grew as the number of locally born children increased. However, Chinese schools were modeled after schools in China, used the same curriculum. They were very basically China orientated. The colonial government began from this period on monitoring, controlling schools in Malaysia, and they will develop various kinds of acts and all that basically to regulate and control. But it comes from this period. Likewise, for the few Tamil schools, they were also regulated, but they were also in their turn oriented towards India. In summary, the education policy of the colonial state sowed the seeds of separatism. This is a term that was used by Philip Loh, that very important person who studied colonial policy, education policy. The majority attended separate vernacular schools, but a small group was brought together in the English schools, socializing them into more westernized ways. They liked to play rugby and cricket, which of course is not the main pastime. They were playing kalitoy and marbles instead, and separated them from the masses. Few attended secondary education, even fewer went to the university. Before the war, we already established Raffles College and King Edward VI School of Dentistry and Medicine, isn't it, in Singapore. The British had a plan. Then the second period then is this decolonization period, but it's marked by a failure to set up a national educational system. The British had a plan to develop English schools as the basis of a single system of multiracial schools teaching English to replace the four separate streams. The controversy, however, occurred when the Barnes report and then the Fernwu report, which investigated Chinese schools, and then this national schools education ordinance was proposed in 1952. In the end, the colonial state failed to achieve its goals. So this period was an opportunity when you could have done something with the English schools in particular. They did this in India, they did this in other colonies, but they failed to achieve this goal in Malaysia. Three reasons for this. The majority of Malays and Chinese objected to a policy of primary education in English. And this will continue to haunt us. You always have reservations on the part of a lot of Chinese medium schools and also Malay medium. The colonial state was not able or prepared to invest the vast amounts of money needed to build new national schools to attract students away from the vernacular schools. So it was not as though you were just investing in English schools. You had to attract them from the Chinese schools as well. But they couldn't do this also because after the war there was a tremendous demand for schooling. A lot of people had not gone to school for a few years, so the enrollment immediately after the war was double, triple, because there were so many people trying to catch up, and closing vernacular schools was therefore out of the question. Hence, all four streams of primary schools continued to exist, even expanded during this first 10 years after the war. Meanwhile, the English schools received the most funds, they received the best trained teachers, and secondary school and secondary education English was expanded. More than that, they also established the University of Malaya in 1949, which provided English school graduates with an outlet for tertiary education. None for the Chinese educated, the Malay educated. At any rate, very few people ended up in the University of Malaya. It was very, very exclusive. And if you had made it by, to the university, you were really on the way up. The Chinese schools also grew rapidly after the war with community support. We talked just now about can we turn our educational system to something which is more community oriented, more local support. The Chinese schools actually is a model of this. It also adopted, after the war, Malayan curriculum. They wrote new textbooks, and then teachers began to be trained locally, and some aid began to be given to the Chinese schools after 1952. Formation of the two important Chinese organizations, the Jiaozhong and the Dongzhong, together regarded as the Dongjiaozhong. With the MCA, they formed this Sanda Jigou, three main organizations, which actually was super duper powerful, and it launched this, Chinese educational movement, which has continued, to play a very important role, and they can pressure the present government as well as all the Chinese-based political parties to take note of their demands. At this point, there was no Lasallian educational movement launched yet. The MALEC and the Penang LEC and the Sarawak, this is in a sense, attempt to try to begin to bring us together as a movement to pressure for certain kinds of policies. But the Chinese educational movement was launched already from way back prior to independence. This was one of the things that we looked at when we were talking about the way forward for LaSalle schools for tomorrow. And one of the things was actually we are not able to pressure the government in any way, as a group. Quite apart from the fact that we thought in terms of SXI and SJI and LaSalle, and we were also not thinking Lasallian as such. So this is in a sense something that's changing. We're thinking more Lasallian, which enables us to then mobilize ourselves as a larger group with a common interest. But the Chinese education movement actually symbolizes this ability. Responsibility for education policy then, this is the third section, Integration in Common Educational System, 1956 to 69. Responsibility for education policy passed from British hands to Alliance government after 55, and the Razak Committee report was presented in 1956, which became the basis of later on the Education Act. The most important recommendation was to expand primary education. Following Rahman Talib's report of 1960, primary education was provided free. So we had large increases in enrollments. So the Malaysian educational system is actually, promotes this democratization in the sense of bringing students together. And today, we are negligible in a sense of students who are out of school. It's except for, I suppose, increasingly you notice more and more people are now doing homeschooling. So they're out of the school system as such. But this is one of the achievements of the Malaysian government. So dramatic increases in secondary school naturally followed. Government expenditure on education has also increased. And you can't fault the Malaysian government for making allocations for education. They have done that, substantially every time. In all the 5 Malaysia plans, you can look at the records on this. The question you can have is, how do they allocate it within education? Do they overstress this or rather than over some other requirements? Number 2, the absorption of the majority of schools then into the national system of education followed. Recommendations of the Razak Committee emblemized the maximum consensus possible. Remember the initial agreement, the attempt by the colonialists was to actually use English as the basis of bringing all the 4 streams together. But we didn't, it failed. So what happens then? A new way to bring this about this national educational system was created following the Razak Committee report. And here we have all 4 streams of primary school were accepted into a common stream. The basis of integration will be a common curriculum rather than a single medium of instruction. I have to run. So this is from primary school, it runs to secondary school education, it gets absorbed. Majority of English secondary schools then joined in. In fact, during this period, English continued to play a very important role. And this was like the heyday of the Lasallian school, the mission school, the English schools, up to 1969. You know, and we look back and we're very nostalgic about these times. We were actually doing very well in all areas. Actually there was a policy already in place, which gets fully implemented after the NEP gets introduced. Federal government's role is important in education, expanded in other aspects, quite apart from setting up a national educational system. All schools within national educational system then had a common curriculum, took common public exams. The federal control curriculum then have become our central features. And then we had a unified teaching scheme. And then you have this federal government as the sole employer of all teachers within the national system. This is extremely important when thinking about this centralization. English maintained its dominant role during this period. Meanwhile then, they also expanded tertiary level education and never really satisfied all the needs. Democratizing education at the higher level. Sorry, I jumped the NEP period. But you know what happened as a result of NEP? We began to convert into Malay at primary, secondary, and finally the upper levels. And then we introduced a quota system. You know, and this was all again under the rubric of democratizing education, which is actually not balancing simply in terms of bringing more students in, but actually bringing more Bumiputras, Malays, you know, into the educational system, especially at tertiary level. Up to 1990, federal government engaged with three issues: expanding the need, but it changed in the 50s. It was primary school, secondary school in the 60s, and in the 70s and 80s. You know, we began to cater for this need at the tertiary level. Integration of this into a single system. So this is achieved to a great extent, and then was to redress the ethnic imbalance. Okay, and also they began to expand at the pre-university level, Malaya Dunia Science Colleges, Mo Sekolah, Asrama, and so on. Today, due to globalization and need to compete globally, more universities, but also new educational trends, privatization, and the use of BI. More public universities, today we have about 27. Some of these universities are given a lot of funds so that they can compete globally. USM has this APEX status. There are 5 research universities. The other 20 odd are very jealous that we get so much money. You know, under new legislation, we began to actually expand tertiary level education. Private universities are owned by government-linked companies, Petronas, MMU, Telecoms, and then the BN parties as well. Foreign universities also opened up. Private colleges twinned, and then you begin to also have private primary and secondary school education, and even the international schools, and all these restrictions to prevent, you know, too many local students getting involved in private schools, international schools have also been reduced. All taught in English. So actually, you know, there is this alternative educational system which has been emerging on the side. It was under such circumstances that PPS-MI was introduced into the government schools too. You know, the idea was globalization, the idea was privatization. They were doing it, we also have to do it. In the universities, 4 years converted to 3 years, and we've discovered that 3 years is not enough. People don't have the necessary skills and all that, and so we want to actually now give them 4 years again, because they don't have the soft skills. Lastly, viewed from this perspective, developments in Malaysian education can be considered a success, but there are serious problems. Not only the decline in BI, but also in our, you know, our competency in science and mathematics. And this was reviewed in this UNDP Millennium Development Goals report recently. We can't compete with the likes of China and Vietnam and Singapore in terms of achievement, in Singapore in terms of our maths and science education. Problems related to teaching of history, overly emphasizing Ketuhanan Melayu, Islam in our curriculum, or the declining quality of teaching overall. Because we tell our students, you don't study, you'll become a teacher. You know, and so they don't desire to become teachers like Brother Vincent and Brother Anthony Rogers and all these people, you know, and you know. For me, these are related to overall political problems in the country. Last slide. First, why? How is this so? Constitutionally in Malaysia, education is a prerogative of the federal government. In all federal systems, education is where actually things get decentralized. So you have, you know, towns actually running universities in Japan, in Germany, and so on and so forth, apart from the states and then the federal government. And you also have private universities. So you have government at 3 levels, you know, all teaching, education, but here we over-centralize this. Second political process in Malaysia, one party in power for more than 50 years, you actually politicize the whole educational system. And then that patronage sets in, they use this for patronage purposes. So people have written political science about this money politics, patronage. It entered into our educational system as well. So no competency, accountability and transparency, and then the bureaucracy, which is supposed to be neutral, gets compromised. So it gets compromised. The polite words that we use is slang sets in and indulgences take place. The lousy word is, you know, incompetence and actually corruption. And finally, on account of the NEP, the educational system further expanded and was used for. So how do we go? What is the last? However, on account of the NEP, democratization of education has occurred. We have a large multi-ethnic middle class today. The middle class clamors for democracy and good governance. The clamor for better education for our children is not unrelated to these political demands. Not only non-Burmese, but Burmese too very dissatisfied. You know, they are the products. So this is, in a sense, the product of the NEP. You've created a Malay middle class, which is actually shares a lot of your desires as non-Bumi Putras. On the one hand, the NEP led to ethnic tensions. On the other hand, the multi-ethnic middle class are demanding for more rights and participation, including over educational matters. So this is where, in a sense, for me, this is the reason, the main reason why we must remain in the mainstream educational system. You know, there is a battle to be fought to reclaim, you know, our rights over education. It is a very democratic, you know, a lot of people, it's very multi-ethnic. You go out, you actually run away from this, you enter in a very elitist realm rather than democratic realm. You also run into a more exclusively non-Malay, whereas the main educational system is actually very multi-ethnic. Thank you very much.
Lasallians, question time.
Good morning, Doctor. Nicholas from Malacca. A very comprehensive presentation. I think if you given more time, you could explain even more in detail. I think because of short of time. But from what I posed earlier, based on all these challenges that we have, how does this Lasallian spirituality play its role in our current education system? Other than being a guinea pig, or what do I say, irrelevant at times, where we cannot portray our true spirituality. How in this turmoil, I use the word turmoil, can we still be Lasal in the true fact, where people see our schools very different, not only providing premier students, A-class students, yes, every school we need to achieve, but how in this particular situation, people can see us apart, we are separate. How can the spirituality, you know, shine again after these 160 years? Thank you.
I suppose the question of spirituality also needs to be defined. For me, you know, my spirituality is associated with, you know, being extremely democratic, concerned about the last, least and lost, so to speak. You know, so it's if I'm engaging with the last, the least, the lost, for me that's being very spiritual. You know, and my faith is also one which is not about excluding people, but it must be as inclusive as possible. So in a sense, engaging with the educational system, the public educational system, is actually an opportunity for us to pursue our spirituality. You know, and there I think the lovely thing about our LaSalle schools today is that in spite of all these new constraints and, you know, centralization, actually there are rooms for us to maneuver still. And I think, you know, we have been doing this for a long, long time. In political science, which I teach, increasingly the norm is not to look at the state, the government, the government machinery, as all powerful, omnipotent, and they can control everything. You know, these days we talked about civil society being able to negotiate around all these rules and regulations. And there are these opportunities. And, you know, there is room for us to actually work around these things. You know, and in spite of the fact that things are so centralized, all our teachers are actually government servants, you know, there are a lot of rules and do's and don'ts, you know, but you can do something about that. And it's important to engage now, because if you don't, we might actually cross a threshold, you know, as a result of which you might actually lose all your opportunities. You know, by this juncture, it is quite opportune for us to be involved and engage. So I don't want to talk about other aspects, you know, pursuing outside of the school proper, like Brother Finton was sharing with us about Lasallian Learning Center. You know, this will come out, I think, tomorrow especially.
Morning, Doctor. Brother Justin from Sabah. Can you explain, Doctor, why in planning and in policy making, East Malaysia seems to be always sidelined, including your study?
The fact of the matter is we are extremely ignorant, you know, about Sabahans and Sarawakians, you know. And in a sense, I think Sabah and Sarawak at the point of their participation in Malaysia in 1963 actually had very autonomous educational systems. You know, and this was actually part of the 20 points, the 16 points in Sarawak and all that. But I think in the case of Sabah, this was given up. You know, this was given up, and there was controversy about this, and everything also converted into Bahasa BM. But actually in Sarawak, technically speaking, you still have this autonomy. But because you have invited the federal government to come in, they have begun to then play an extremely important role in terms of, you know, following the rest of Peninsula. Now, on the one hand, I think one has to recognize that it's extremely important to try to have a common, you know, commonness. But, you know, sometimes we must try to avoid this, if it results in over-centralization of things. I think one of the slides that I missed show you, or maybe it was there but I didn't mention it, is in this day and age of globalization, it is extremely important for us to decentralize. You know, and because you have to make decisions immediately. You cannot wait. And this pertains not only to trade and investments, but also in educational matters. You know, and the trend, I mean, I visited Humboldt University in Berlin not so long ago, and I was, to my surprise, it's actually a university run by the town of Berlin. Some 70% of their budget comes from the city of Berlin. And then the federal government subsidizes, and then there's community money coming to run this. In Japan, you have Osaka Metropolitan University, which is run by Osaka. Then you have, you know, the imperial universities, which are fed, you know, national level. But you also have provincial, you know, prefectural universities. So we want to do this. And I think, you know, in a sense, if Sabah Sarawak still has this autonomy, you should guard it very, very well, you know, and preserve it, you know, because you might be actually the model for us, you know, out of this morass, as it were, you know. So for me, this independence is extremely important, and I'm talking about not independence only in terms of, oh, we privatize. That's going into the private sector. We're talking about actually an autonomy within the public educational system. You know, and the public, don't forget the educational system, yeah, zero time. You know, there's a national level, there is a local level on the ground, and then there's a middling ground, which is actually state level and all that. My dream is actually that in the future, our educational policy is going to be determined by not only a public sector, but a public sector which is multi-tiered, and also a private sector. And the private sector can be not only money making, it can be actually based on a cooperative basis. And how beautiful that would be. Can you imagine different options, that we can provide to our children, the various kinds of ideas that can be generated, because people have different perspectives on this, and it can also be a pursuit of excellence. It doesn't mean that if you have many, then you lose, integrity, you lose, competency. Thank you very much.